Hey, I'm Josh from Bernal Cutlery. Today we're going to do a little sharpening video looking at thinning with this Hitohira GR Suminagashi clad Aogami 2 knife. This is what they look like new, and this is our tester. And we've gone ahead and done a little bit of flattening, and I've been using this for about 3 weeks now at home. This is what it started out like, and I started thinning the sides a little bit, but let's take a look. We're going to be using the Takara Zukushi Blue Marble Stone. This is one that we've glued down to a used stone die. This was on one of the Arashiyama stones, and you can see stone started out quite a bit thicker, and this is the great thing about single grit stones. You can glue them down to a piece of wood and use up the entire stone as opposed to being left with a little core of stone like on a combo. All right, to start with, we're going to use our stone flattener to raise a tiny bit of slurry. Of course, we want to make sure our stone is flat, but the second great thing about flatteners like this Atoma 140 is that we can start a little bit of slurry here. Getting a little bit of slurry on your stone before you start working really helps the stone to work a lot quicker. You'll notice when you're flattening, thinning rather, most knives is that along these big wide kiribas that you'll see some dimples, and this is entirely normal. So it's not necessarily a flaw. This is just how the knives are ground. They're not necessarily always finished with a stone at the workshop that they come from. Once you start flattening, you'll see where there's a couple low spots from the wheel that they were grinding these kiribas in with. We're going to be working on this big wide primary bevel here. As the knife gets sharpened in, it becomes thicker behind the edge. This hasn't been sharpened down very much. Typically, as you've sharpened halfway through the exposed core steel, then the knife will feel thick and chunky and you'll want to thin it. If you keep on top of it and do that before, you've lost a lot of the edge of the core steel. Your knife will never become wedgy. When we're sharpening, typically we're just working on the edge, like so. If you'd like to see a video on our double bevel technique, check it out. It's up as well. Here though, we're going to be working on a much wider swath of metal that's going to come straight down. Nice gentle light pressure starting from this boundary line up here. And again, always staying over the center of the stone. And let's take a look. All right. See a couple of those dimples. That's okay. That's going to be part of the beginning flattening life of a lot of different knives. And we've started removing metal mostly from the top of this kiriba, this zone here. Next, we're going to go towards the area of the core steel and the cladding. I'm going to liven this mud up a little bit with a couple drops of water. Don't overdo it. I'm moving my fingers down into the center of the kiriba for this procedure. On many knives, this will start to feel a little different. The cladding is softer and grabs the stone more. The core steel is going to be a tiny bit more slippery and harder. If you do this every time you sharpen your knife, you'll never get a wedgy knife. We still want to come in and put in a little bit of Utoba, of our active edge or micro bevel. A little bigger than a micro bevel maybe, but you get the idea. That strengthens it. If we cut with only this angle here, the first time that you cut, it would feel amazing, but it would be all chipped up and ragged before too long. If we just had to spend 20 minutes working on this side, this would be a good time to flatten this stone. It would have gotten a little bit out of true in the zone that we were working in. However, being that I was just working for a minute, not necessary. Switching hands, pushing with my dominant hand, secondary hand is just keeping everything in line, keeping anything from flying away. By working symmetrically on each side, we can keep much more even work and symmetrical work on each side of the blade. There's no right or wrong way to do this really, provided that you're doing the grinding in the right spot. But I have found that switching hands like this really does help to make this more accurate and to get more consistent, even results on each side. One thing that you can count on not being even and consistent are the initial grinds. Many knives will come with a kiriba that has been sandblasted in. Maybe you have a karochi finish over here and a line that is not necessarily always in line with the grind. You might find that once you start grinding like this, once you start thinning, that the line that was formed between the boundary of the karochi and the kiriba doesn't line up with the actual kiriba that you grind in. This is okay. It's not really a defect. It's a cosmetic concern. It'll blend out with time, of course. And we want to look to make sure that our cladding does not get into the edge itself. This looks great though. We'll keep going. All right, I got enough work done with my previous stone to move up to the next one. Arguably, we could try and get out some of these dimples. However, sometimes those take quite a long time to work out. If you really want to spend the time with a coarse stone to get them out when you get started, feel free to do so. Don't feel like this is going to impede the functionality of the knife. It won't. If those dimples are on the edge themselves, check to see that your knife is straight. And if the dimple is, if it's not a bend that needs to be corrected, then you do want to make sure that you grind in some from the edge so that the presence of that dimple at the edge itself isn't going to weaken the edge. Otherwise, this might be a little unsightly. It's essentially temporary. I'm using a light pressure with this Jinko Alto. Pressure will really affect how a stone will work like this. Softer stones can give you different results with water and pressure. And with this particular stone, if you push too hard, it's not at its best. And you hear that difference when I move the blade a little bit up so that I'm working on the core steel. And you can start to see the surface of the stone change a little bit. When you start to get these little ripples forming, a tiny bit more water can help break those up. One thing I mentioned in a previous video with our double bevel sharpening is to not let your fingers go over the end of the stone. This is super, super important. If you're working and your fingers are going over the end of the stone and your finger slips while you're working, that's kind of ruined your sharpening session, so don't do that. The purpose of this stone is to remove the scratches from the last one. Having a slower progression of stones that you go up when you're doing this kind of work, it helps. There are aesthetic concerns with removing every single scratch from the previous stone. If you want to get a really super beautiful finish, then take your time. Make sure that you get every single last scratch out. If you're looking at this as from a utilitarian standpoint, you want a knife that cuts well, that cuts smooth, that you can get back to work with. Don't worry about removing every single last scratch. Provided you don't have tons of really coarse scratches in this kiriba, it's not going to affect the cutting of the knife. But if you leave in deep scratches on the sides here after your 1000 stone, you'll find that it scrapes against the food while you're working and doesn't give you a nice cutting feel. We're going to keep removing some scratches. All right. We're polishing the kiriba a little bit after thinning it with the 1200 stone, taking out the 1200 stone scratches with the Jinko Alto, which gives us this kind of hazy look here. And we're going to progress to our Arashiyama 6000 stone. This stone has a mix of natural and man-made abrasives as well, so it's not as super fine as some other 6000s, but it's a great bang for the buck, and we've been using this stone for a super long time and really like the feel of the cutting from this stone. It was kind of designed, I believe, to mimic a natural stone, and while there's no replacement for a natural Japanese stone, this is very similar in some ways. All right, starting to slide a little bit underneath here. Time to wring out my little pad. Starting to get some little ripples forming on the stone. I'm going to add a few drops of water to help manage that mud. But I definitely want to keep that mud on the stone, but I want to remove the mud from the knife to help it from slipping under my fingers. Working the edge a tiny bit. That's important too. Now let's switch sides. All right. Now I'm going to work the opposite side. Added a couple drops of water, help loosen up that mud a little bit. And again, using a nice light pressure here. We don't want to jam the knife into the stone a whole lot. That can make it kind of stick too much and can prematurely load the stone up with metal. My aim here is from a little bit more of a utilitarian standpoint with this finish. This is to keep it from rasping against the food that we'll be cutting. And I'm not so concerned about creating a flawless finish with this job right here. Working on the edge. So I'm not going to spend a ton of time here. This doesn't necessarily have to be something that takes you hours and hours to do. If you want to put the time in and get a really nice finish, that's, that's great. You don't have to get good results though. So I could definitely keep going, but this is enough to get it back to work. Back cutting smoothly. Certainly could remove some more of these scratches, but you're not going to feel them when you're working per se. This will really improve the cutting quality of this knife. If we were to only sharpen it on the very edge itself, very soon it's going to be cracking carrots, wedging in onions, all that sort of stuff. So this keeps it at its original fighting weight, and I'm happy with these results. Wow, that was something. All right. Well, thank you for bearing with me and hanging in there for this whole video. Here's our finished results so far. This is definitely a work in progress. I think like any knife will be. If you plan on sharpening your knife and putting it away and never using it, that seems a shame. But, a couple things that I kind of repeat a little bit, I suppose, and they're my opinion, and is that there's definitely different perspectives and different objectives with sharpening. There are aesthetic desires for how a knife is going to look, and then there's functional things about how it's going to work. And I think the aesthetic concerns can kind of dominate the conversation a little bit. This is my opinion. Not to trash talk anybody that's spending a lot of time making really beautiful looking work, but you don't have to do that to get a good result. Some things that should be understood with the way that hand-forged knives can be shaped that can make for some things that frustrate people. We talked about the dimples a little bit. And these are just low spots from when the knife was ground on a big water wheel. And this spot right here for that dimple is just the classic spot to find it. Another thing is that you will more likely than not find you don't have an even shinogi line. Here, the way that this knife had some hammering There were some low spots in here from the grinding and hammering, and that made for a high spot here. So, you know, if you wanted to try and get a straight line here, you could try, but from my experience, sharpening knives that have an irregular face like this, it's just not going to be regular. This is a handmade thing. It's going to have a little bit of lump and waving. You could probably get that spot down there if you wanted to put in the time. But, you know, I think it's important not to chastise yourself, you know, for your sharpening. More, you know, enjoy it. You know, go rather than kind of losing your mind cutting paper with it, go cut some onions. See how it cuts a couple weeks down the line as well. I think this is a really important concern for, you know, judging the quality of a sharpening is not just how it is right off of the stones, but how is it a week down the line. You know, make some judgments about where you want to finish off of those experiments. If you just want to sharpen your knife and get to it and don't want to, you know, really pick all the little bits out, then you don't need to. If you want to experiment and all that, that's great too. You know, sharpening is a worthwhile pursuit for people that are going to be really going down the rabbit hole, or people that just want a knife that cuts their food better. So, you know, no judgments here. And I hope this was helpful. If you like what we're doing, subscribe and all that business. And we hope to see you back. Thanks again.